All right, you guys, welcome. We are going to start off this kind of series of lectures about these nutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And we're going to start with carbohydrates, sugars, which are most of our favorites. So here we go. So before we dive into sugar and carbohydrates, let's do a little review from last week. So if you want to pause the video and go ahead and answer these questions and try it out on your own, maybe look up the answers if you get stumped, and then we'll go through them together. All right, so hopefully you were able to pause the video and answer these questions. So what are the two main functions of water when we're talking about in the body? So our two main functions are metabolism and helping to maintain body temperature. So we went into some detail about water and metabolism, right? So most of our chemical reactions in our body either require water or produce water. So that's a huge requirement. And then water also has some special features. So we talked a little bit about the specific heat capacity of water and why our blood doesn't boil or why our cells don't burst and boil if we go outside of that normal body temperature range, right? So it helps to maintain a consistent body temperature even if we are exposed to extreme environmental temperatures. Okay. Now, where do we get our water and how do we lose water, right? So water in has to kind of equal our water out to maintain hydration. Otherwise, we are going to become dehydrated. So obviously our main source of water in is drinking, right? So we drink our water. But also we have to remember that we do have some water in our food as well. So the type of feed, whether it's a high moisture feed versus a dry feed, we do get some water on and in our food. But then we talked a little bit about metabolic water. So we just said that a lot of our metabolic reactions in our body produce water as a reactant. So that is where a lot of desert animals and animals that undergo hibernation are going to get their water, as well as preformed water. So preformed water is what happens when we're kind of in a negative energy balance and our body starts breaking down our own tissues, such as breaking down protein, breaking down fat. And some of the products of that is going to be water. Okay, so those last two are very important for our animals that live in low water environments or are hibernating, right? So what about the water out, right? How do we lose water from the body? Obviously our urine, right? So we urinate. Urine is mostly water, right? As well as some in our feces. And we talked about different species having different fecal consistencies, and some are a little more watery than others, right? So that just kind of is variable. We talked about insensible water loss, right? So just our kind of, evaporative loss from our lungs and our skin, right? So it's kind of a hard thing to measure, right? But it's fairly consistent of the insensible loss just from respiration and the loss at the skin, right? Just evaporative loss. Sweat is also can be a big water out, right? Water loss, especially for species that have well-formed sweat glands, such as humans and horses. So that's something to take into consideration, but it is also very variable, right? So it just depends on the activity level of the animal. Okay, so our water in has to equal our water out, right? So if we remember that, that makes sense, right? To keep ourselves from becoming dehydrated. Now, if anyone remembers how much water we actually need, and that is quite variable on how much we consume, how much dry matter we consume, right? So does anyone remember how much water per dry matter we need? So we need 2 to 5 kilograms of water, and kilograms is the same as liters. I don't know if I mentioned that in the lecture previously, but if you're talking about kilograms, you can also call it a liter. So they are equal in their measurements. So we said that the majority of animals needed between 2 to 5 kilograms or liters, if you want to talk about it in liters, since we're talking about a fluid, right, per kilogram of dry matter consumed. Okay. And of course, we have to kind of consider, it's dry matter consumed, it's not necessarily dry matter fed, right? So that can be a different value. And that's just, we're not getting into the nitty-gritty details, but you have to remember, just in general, when we're talking about nutrition and feeding animals, you can feed them all you want, but what are they actually consuming, right? What are they actually eating? And that's something that, all of us as animal caretakers, that's something that's very important. Is the animal actually eating what we are feeding them? So just as a side note, kind of got a little off track there, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a later lecture. But assuming they're eating what you're feeding them, right? What are they consuming? So if we look at our question here, how much water in kilograms or liters would an animal need if they consumed 8 pounds of dry matter feed? So all of our calculations are in kilograms, right? Or liters. So we have to convert that 8 pounds of dry matter into kilograms, okay? So if we do that, okay, remember we have 2.2 pounds per each kilogram, right? So 2.2 pounds equals 1 kilogram. So if we say that we have 8 pounds of feed, we'd have to divide by the 2.2 pounds to get our kilogram weight, which is about 3.6 kilograms of dry matter. So what's our range, right? So we have to either multiply by 2, okay, or multiply by 5, okay? So, or we can do 3.6 times 5, okay? So we have to either multiply it by 2 and then by 5, which gives us a range of about 7 to 18 kilograms of water or liters, okay? So that's about the range, and that's a big range, right? So it's a big range. So obviously, 7 would be on the low end and 18 would be on the high end. So if you're somewhere in the middle, that's probably pretty good, and it just depends on all the other things of the water loss, right? Is the animal more active, or what other considerations do you have to say, how much water should I offer them? But you have to offer them at least that amount, right? Usually we offer them probably more water than they need, just so that we're sure that they are getting their full amount of water. So this is very rare that you'll actually probably use this calculation and say, okay, I have to measure out the exact amount of water that I'm going to feed the animal. But you want to make sure that whatever water container they have, right, can hold that amount of water that they require. Right? So that makes sense, right? You don't want a smaller bowl of water than that animal actually needs, or else they could have a problem if they are drinking not enough water, right? So anyways, that's just food for thought, right? And this comes more into play probably for these smaller animals that, you know, you have these smaller containers for their water. So yeah, there's the answer there, kind of in amongst my writing. Hopefully you can see it. Okay. So now let's get into what we're going to be talking about today and a little bit, you know, into the next couple lectures in our different important nutrients, right? So we've talked about water as being kind of the number one important nutrient, and now we're going to get into some of these other nutrients throughout the lecture, throughout the course even, right? So first we're going to talk about carbs. So what are the functions of carbohydrates in the body, right? Why do we need carbohydrates? What are the different types of carbohydrates, right? We keep saying sugar, but what is sugar specifically? And what are the different types of carbohydrates that we need to consider, right? And then how do we metabolize carbs in the body? How do we actually break down a carbohydrate and use them in the body? And then a little bit about what are some disorders of that carbohydrate metabolism. So who consumes carbohydrates, right? Who eats carbs? Well, most of us eat carbs, right? So especially our omnivores, monogastric herbivores, right? We're considered an omnivore. We do have quite a high carb intake, and carbs are our primary energy source, okay? So we'll talk about carbohydrates as an energy source here in a minute. Ruminants. Ruminants also have a high carb intake, but unlike our monogastric friends, ruminants are herbivores. They actually use fatty acids as their primary energy source, which is quite interesting. So they actually utilize the carbohydrates for their gut flora, the bacteria and stuff in there, and then they're going to actually use fatty acids as their primary energy source. So as usual, ruminants are a little weird. So again, we'll talk a lot more about ruminants in another lecture as well. Carnivores, right? So carnivores are the opposite. They actually have a very low carb intake. So they don't actually use carbohydrates really for an energy source. They use fats and proteins as their primary energy source, right? So we can utilize all three as an energy source: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And it just depends on our GI tract and how our bodies work on what our bodies prefer as our energy source. So what are the functions of carbohydrates, right? So we've talked about them being used as energy. So both plants and animals use carbohydrates as energy. But there are some other things that we have to consider as well. They are a structural component of plants. So cell wall of plants, right? Starch. So they do have this kind of structural component between the cellulose and starch for plants. And then we also require them in our DNA and RNA structure. So we do have a sugar phosphate backbone of that DNA strand. So it is very important as a structural component of our DNA. And then we'll talk a little bit about these different compounds in our body: proteoglycans, glycoproteins, glycolipids. A lot of them are very important for our cell membrane structure and used for signaling in the cells, things like that. So lots of cell membrane components are made up of or partially made up of carbohydrates. They might be a combo of, so anywhere where you see glyco, that means it's a carbohydrate. So such as a glycoprotein is part glycogen or part carbohydrate and part protein, and a glycolipid is a part of a carbohydrate and part of a lipid. So they're kind of these combo compounds that we'll talk a little bit more about. So let's first talk about using carbohydrates as energy, because that is really a big source of energy for most animals. And most animal cells actually prefer glucose as its energy source. So if you think back to maybe biology, physiology, anything like that that you talked about, cellular respiration, that first step of cellular respiration is glycolysis, right? So utilizing glucose and then using it throughout the cycle of cellular respiration for energy. So cellular energy is very important, right? But we can also break down a lot of things and convert them into glucose, or convert them into things that we can put into the cellular respiration cycle. So there's really limited data on true dietary requirements for carbs, because we can convert fats and proteins into carbs and into energy. So do we really need carbs is kind of a question for a lot of people, even though it's the simplest way to get glucose. So our bodies crave carbohydrates. As many of you guys know, right, you crave sugar. Sugar is very addicting. Carbohydrates are very addicting. So our bodies do crave it as an energy source, because it's a very simple energy source. So just as kind of a reference, you guys don't need to know these numbers, but I have a table here of just kind of a dietary reference intake for carbohydrates such as sugars and starches. And so this is for humans. So it just goes through the life stages of different age groups. And the EAR, or estimated average requirement, is on the left, which is really just the level of intake required to meet half of healthy individuals in a group, whereas the RDA, or the recommended dietary allowance, is more the level of intake required for nearly all healthy individuals in a group. So that's kind of more the standard value. So it's in grams per day. So they're saying that pretty much all through the age groups from 1 year old to over 70 years old, we require 130 grams of carbohydrates per day. So that's just kind of the standard. And then if you look at pregnancy and lactation, that can increase, right? So that makes sense, right? Because you're increasing your energy requirements. So just kind of an interesting thing. So we do have a dietary reference intake for carbohydrates. Okay, just like I said, you don't need to know those numbers. Just you can find these things, right? So this was found at the National Academic Press. Okay. So a big thing to talk about carbohydrates and energy is how we actually store carbohydrates as energy in our body. So how do we actually store it, right? So plants, if we're talking about plants, they store their energy or carbohydrates as starch. So they can break down the starch and utilize that. But we also then eat the plants that are full of the starch and full of that energy, and our body then can break down the starch and utilize it as energy and convert it into energy. So that's how plants store energy. We store energy as glycogen. So when we eat sugar, starch, anything, we break it down to glucose, right? So glucose is the simplest form of a carbohydrate, and we'll talk a little bit more about those different forms of carbohydrates. And so we can utilize that glucose right away, right? We can utilize that in our cells as energy, but most of the time we are eating more carbohydrates than our body can use. And that's kind of the whole idea behind, carbohydrates make us fat, right? Because we utilize only so much of them, and then we have to store them, or we want to store them for later use because we have this great energy source and we want to store it. So short-term storage of glucose, we store in our liver and a little bit in our muscles as glycogen, okay? But say we have even more than we need, way more than we need, then we actually turn the glucose into fat. So a lot of us think, and this is kind of a big misnomer or misunderstanding of a lot of people, is that fat turns into fat. Fat that you eat turns into fat, and that's incorrect. It's actually glucose that we eat, we turn into fat. Okay, so sugar is what makes us fat. So this is how we store it, right? For later use when we need it. When we don't have an energy source, we can break down that fat, break down that glycogen, and get that glucose out of fat and out of glycogen. Okay. So we know that carbohydrates provide energy, right? So that's great. Sugar equals energy. But now let's talk a little bit about those functions that we may not think about when we think about the functions of carbohydrates. So a big one is it is a structural component of plants. So plants have a cell wall, right? Unlike animal cells that just have a cell membrane. And that cell wall is made up of cellulose. And cellulose is a carbohydrate. So it's a large carbohydrate molecule, and it's made up of a string of glucose molecules that we call a polymer. So polymer just means multiple glucose molecules bound together. And when we talk about cellulose, cellulose is considered kind of insoluble or indigestible as a carbohydrate. So this is what we would consider fiber. Okay, so when you eat plants that are high in fiber, this is high in cellulose. And the majority of us have a hard time breaking down cellulose in our body. Right, so we are not very good at breaking down cellulose. We can maybe break down a little bit of it, but most of it we excrete, right, in our feces. So, high fiber diets helps keep you regular because it kind of brings in the water to try to break it down and keeps everything moving. Whereas if you talk about some of our herbivore friends, right, they consist on high fiber foods, right? So they have found ways to break down that cellulose very, very well. Okay, so they have gut bacteria that help them break down that cellulose into glucose molecules. Okay, whereas we are not as good at that. So here's just a picture of cellulose, showing us that it is a polymer of those glucose molecules. So you just string all those glucose molecules together and you get these cellulose molecules that are all kind of bound together to make the cell wall of a plant cell. So it's just kind of a cool image to show you how to break down that cellulose into glucose. So carbohydrates are also in our DNA and RNA. So they are structural components for the DNA and RNA strands. So we do actually have these simple sugars that are similar to glucose, but not the exact same. They actually have 5 carbons instead of 6 carbons, and they're called ribose and deoxyribose. So they are a building block of the DNA and RNA. So they make up those nucleic acids that make up our DNA and RNA. So if you look at the picture on the left-hand side, you can see the nucleotides that are making up our DNA and RNA, and part of that nucleotide is the sugar. So the deoxyribose for DNA and ribose for RNA. So that makes up the D and the R in DNA and RNA. So kind of going back to, biology and things like that to see what DNA and RNA are. So very important in that kind of sugar phosphate backbone of DNA, right, and RNA. So we can't forget that, right? So these are important sugars as well. So now let's talk a little bit more about those kind of sugar compounds that we find in our body. And essentially, they're very important in our cell membrane. So we have these proteins and lipids that have these chains of carbohydrates stuck on them, and they are embedded within our cell membranes. And so these guys are really important in helping to stabilize our cell membranes, as well as they help in cell signaling. So how cells talk to each other is very important with these glycoproteins and glycolipids. And then another compound called a proteoglycan and even glycoproteins also make up some components of our connective tissues. So if you think back to either anatomy, maybe biology, if we remember what a connective tissue is, we have connective tissue pretty much all throughout our body. So fat, loose connective tissue, which is part of our skin, right under the base of our epidermis, even the dermis, cartilage, bone, all of those guys, tendons, ligaments, all of those are connective tissues in our body. And proteoglycans make up a component of that connective tissue. So again, we find these all throughout our body, which is very important. Another kind of structural component of cell membranes and for connective tissue. Okay. So now let's get into the classification of carbohydrates. So a lot of us have heard the term simple sugar, complex sugar, or complex carbohydrate, simple carbohydrate. So what does all that actually mean? So when we talk about carbohydrates, we're talking about saccharides. So all saccharides have this empirical formula. And an empirical formula means that there's a base formula and that all of them build on top of that. So whatever X is, we can put that into this equation and we will get some sort of saccharide. So the simplest one is glucose, right? So glucose is kind of our standard monosaccharide, okay? Which is one of our simple sugars, which we'll talk about in a minute. But just to kind of show you this empirical formula, glucose is C6, so 6 carbons. So if X is 6, then that means we have 12 hydrogens, right? 2 times 6, 2x. And then we have 6 oxygens, right? So now if you want to talk about other saccharides, you would then multiply this by whatever number you want. So you can multiply it by 2, by 4, whatever, but you get this base empirical formula here, which is kind of, you can think of it as glucose, and that would be your saccharide, okay? So this is kind of this empirical formula for all carbohydrates. So now let's talk about our 3 classes of carbohydrates. So we have monosaccharides, meaning 1, right? Mono is 1. Disaccharides, meaning 2. And polysaccharides, meaning multiple. So monosaccharides and disaccharides are considered simple carbohydrates, okay? And then complex carbohydrates are polysaccharides. So let's go through examples of each of these classes. So let's start with our monosaccharides. So these guys are one of the 2 simple sugars. and they are really the building blocks for all other carbohydrates. Okay, and we have two different types of monosaccharides, and those are considered hexoses, meaning they have 6 carbons, or pentoses, meaning 5 carbons. So we've seen a hexose and we've seen a pentose. Okay, so what are some examples of those? So glucose and fructose and galactose are our 3 hexoses. So glucose and fructose you might have heard of. Galactose a lot of people have not heard of. Okay, so we'll talk about these guys. And then pentoses are 5 carbons. So we have very specific pentoses that we care about, and that's ribose and deoxyribose, which is what we just said are those building blocks of the backbones of RNA and DNA. Okay, so those are simple sugars. They're all monosaccharides. Okay. So if you see, they're very similar in structure, but it just depends on where that the group is on and on which carbohydrate it's on. So again, they're very similar in their structures. It just may depend on which direction their attachments are pointing. Okay, there's technical terms for that, but we're not getting into the chemistry of it, okay? So disaccharides, di meaning 2, right? So they're 2 monosaccharides that are bound together, and these are really our common food components. So when you say sugar, you're actually talking about a disaccharide, okay? So we really don't eat glucose, we eat sugar, right? Okay, so what is sugar? Well, sugar is 1 glucose and 1 fructose. Okay, so they're bound together. Lactose is another one, and that's the sugar component of milk, or the disaccharide that's in milk. And that's glucose and galactose. Okay, and then maltose, which is a form of starch, is glucose and glucose. Okay, so 2 glucose molecules together. Okay, so those are our 3 disaccharides that we care about: sugar or sucrose, lactose, and maltose. So sugar is a very kind of common term, but if you want to talk specifically about the true sugar, it's sucrose. Okay, so sucrose, you really need that OSE at the end, which kind of signifies a saccharide. Okay. So now polysaccharides are really our complex sugar polymers, meaning a polymer is just made up of a lot of monomers, or single compounds. So that means that these guys are made up of thousands of glucose molecules stuck together. So we talked a little bit about starch already as being the storage component for energy in plants. So they store their glucose as starch, right? And we know that we eat a lot of plants that are high in starch. A lot of our cereal grains, a lot of our starchy vegetables such as potatoes, beans, things like that, right? So those are all kind of full of starch. And then glycogen, right? So glycogen is the short-term storage of glucose for animals, right? So we store it in our liver, a little bit in our muscles, and that's the short-term storage, okay? And then cellulose. We said cellulose was really important for the cell walls of plants. So again, it makes up a very strong polymer or polysaccharide to make up that cell wall of plants. And not all of us can break it down, right? So we already saw the structure of cellulose on a previous slide, but now I'm kind of showing you a little bit about glycogen here on the right-hand side. So it's just a bunch of those glucose molecules stuck together. And how they are stuck together determines the polysaccharide. So they are chains of glucose, but some are branched, some are not branched, and that just determines whether it's a starch, glycogen, or cellulose. So how they are stuck together is what determines the polysaccharide, okay? But they're all glucose molecules. So just to kind of show you and illustrate a little bit how all those glucose molecules are put together, I kind of like this table, and you don't need to memorize any of the information on this, but it just gives you, I think, a better visualization of the different polysaccharides. So you can see that cellulose is kind of the most simple shape, right? So they're all just in a strand, they're all together, no branching, right? But if you notice the subunit, the glucose is a beta glucose, so it's a little bit different than our other glucoses, and that's just how the shape of the glucose molecule, and I said those different components are pointing in different directions, right? Those different hydroxyl groups. So just of course, you don't need to know this, but it's just kind of to show you the differences of how and why these different polysaccharides are different. We do have two different types of starch polysaccharides, which is kind of interesting. They both live in plants, right? But one is kind of a spiral shape or kind of the helical shape like we see in DNA, and one is branched. Okay, so just a little bit different on how they come together. And then glycogen is also branched as well. Okay, so you can see the different shapes of these different polysaccharides. But every little dot in those big pictures is a glucose molecule. Okay. So how do we actually metabolize those carbohydrates, right? So we are only able to absorb glucose in the GI tract, and specifically in the small intestine, for most animals anyways. You can different for maybe our ruminants, but again, a lot of our nutrients are absorbed in the small intestine when we're talking about kind of our standard GI tract. So we have to break down these larger carbohydrates, even the disaccharides, which are still considered simple carbohydrates. We still have to break them down and get that glucose separated from whatever other monosaccharide it's stuck to. So how do we do that, right? So our disaccharides and polysaccharides are hydrolyzed, meaning we add water, right? We add water, we add an enzyme, right, to speed up the reaction, and then we can break those bonds of the polysaccharide or the disaccharide to get ourselves that glucose molecule. Okay, so now remember, if you're looking at our empirical formula, you may say, oh, starch only has 10 hydrogens, but you have to remember that it's a compound, right? So it has bonds in there. So you're gonna get rid of some of those hydrogens because you're bound those oxygens together, that one oxygen, which is why we have one less oxygen as well. Okay, so the starch is a larger polysaccharide. So we add water, and we add an enzyme, and then we get our glucose. Okay. So starch is a very common polysaccharide, right, that we eat, right, starch, in a lot of plants. And specifically, if it's that amylose one, that amylose starch, we break that down by amylase, which is a specific enzyme that's found in our saliva, okay? And we can break that down into maltose and glucose. Okay, so maltose is just two glucose molecules together, so you can continue and break down that maltose into two more glucose molecules as well. Okay, so we got to break these bigger components down into the smaller monosaccharides. Specifically, we want glucose. So what about those herbivores out there, right, that pretty much just live on grass, right, and hay, but specifically they live on cellulose, right? So ruminants and hindgut fermenters, such as our horses, um, break down cellulose. How do they do that? Well, they don't do it, but they have microbes or bacteria in their gut, specifically in their stomach if it's a ruminant, or in their large colon if it's a hindgut fermenter, and they undergo microbial fermentation, meaning those bacteria produce an enzyme called cellulase, which can actually break down cellulose into glucose, which is great, right? So they utilize those microbes in their intestines to break down the cellulose for them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to break down the cellulose, just like we cannot really break down cellulose, okay? And now if you're talking specifically about ruminants, they undergo rumen fermentation. And we said they don't actually utilize glucose as their main energy source. They actually utilize what's called a volatile fatty acid. So they do turn that glucose into pyruvate, which is essentially that first step of glycolysis. But then they turn the pyruvate into these fatty acids, and they specifically call them volatile fatty acids. And they use that, propionic, butyric acid, those guys as their energy source, okay, which is kind of interesting because what happens is they utilize a lot of the glucose as energy for the bacteria in their gut, okay? But that important step there, see cellulose on the left-hand side, they need that cellulase produced by the bacteria to break it down into glucose, okay? So again, you don't need to know the specifics of rumen fermentation. It's just kind of to show you how we can utilize glucose in different ways. So what's actually happening in our intestines when we absorb glucose? And you don't need to know the very specific details of glucose absorption, but essentially it takes some transport proteins to get glucose across the cell membrane. Okay, so we actually utilize these glucose transporter proteins essentially to get them across from the inside of the small intestines, which is at the top of the picture in the little picture on the right hand side, across that cell membrane into the cell. And then there's another GLUT2 transport protein that essentially gets it across the other side of the cell and into the blood. So the ultimate goal, right, is to get that glucose into the bloodstream, right, so that it can go around the body and be utilized in different cells in the body. Or it goes to the liver, right, for storage. It can be stored in the liver as glycogen or stored in the rest of the body as fat, okay? But essentially, glucose is really the gold standard, right? We want glucose. But we do have some of our intestinal cells can convert other monosaccharides into glucose. And even the liver cells can convert some monosaccharides to glucose. So essentially, we can't really utilize any of the other monosaccharides, so galactose or fructose, as energy. So we can only utilize the ones we can convert into glucose, okay? So that's our whole goal, is to get to glucose. So we can convert some fructose into glucose, okay? So we said that we want that glucose, right? So that's really what we want. But depending on maybe what we eat, we may have extra glucose, or if we don't get enough glucose, or we've skipped a meal or something like that and you need the glucose, we can store and break down glycogen for glucose, right? That's our short-term storage of glucose, mostly in the liver, a little bit in the muscle. And so we can either create glycogen from glucose if we have too much, or we can break down glycogen into glucose if we need more glucose. Okay, so this is regulated by our blood sugar levels. Okay, so our body monitors our blood sugar very closely, and if we need more glucose or less glucose, then that is done via hormones. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But our blood sugar level is very tightly regulated, okay? Because that energy level, we need a specific level. So the two kind of building blocks of glycogen and breakdown of glycogen is called glycogenesis. So think Genesis is kind of the beginning, the building of something. So glyco is always our sugar, right? Glycogen, glucose. So glycogenesis is the building of glycogen from extra glucose. And then glycogenolysis, think lysis is the breaking of something, is the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. So this is kind of always happening in our liver, right? So we're constantly kind of producing glycogen from glucose, and we're constantly breaking it down into glucose into our bloodstream. So these two chemical reactions, glycogenesis and glycogenolysis, are kind of happening, often, right? Because this is the short-term storage of glucose. Okay. So the other way to get glucose, if you don't break it down from glycogen or get it in your food, is gluconeogenesis. So think neo means new. So new is you are going to create glucose from a tissue or a non-carbohydrate metabolite, such as fat and protein, so lipids and amino acids. So you can actually break down lipids and amino acids to get glucose, okay? And that's called gluconeogenesis, okay? And this is how ruminants actually get their glucose. So we said, which is kind of this roundabout way because of course ruminants have to be different, right? So ruminants break down that cellulose using those microbes that have the enzyme to get the glucose, but then they turn the glucose into these volatile fatty acids. Now they're actually going to undergo gluconeogenesis to turn those volatile fatty acids back into glucose. Kind of a backwards way to think about it, but like I said, they utilize that glucose from their food to feed the microbes, and then the microbes break down everything for them, and so it's kind of this give and take relationship with them, okay? So if you're a non-ruminant, you don't go through that process. You don't have to undergo gluconeogenesis to get your glucose. You're just going to absorb it directly from your food, or you're going to break down that glycogen for it. But if you're fairly food deprived, if you've gone through your glycogen stores, then you're going to undergo gluconeogenesis. And then you're going to take it from your fat and your protein. Okay, so non-ruminants rarely undergo gluconeogenesis, okay, because they should have a steady, supply of glucose or glycogen. Okay, so only really maybe in a negative energy balance or something like that would they undergo gluconeogenesis. Okay, but this is a very normal process for ruminants. So don't panic, and you don't need to know this slide. It's just showing you the physiology behind turning that volatile fatty acid, that propionic acid, if you want to say that, at the bottom of the slide, and how it breaks it down or turns it into succinyl-CoA to go through the TCA cycle, which is our normal kind of a normal metabolic process to get glucose. Okay, so they kind of back metabolize their volatile fatty acids to get the glucose. So again, backwards way of doing it, right? But it works for them, but of course ruminants have to be a little bit different. Okay, so they don't use that glucose that they break down from cellulose. They turn that glucose into volatile fatty acids, which then they undergo gluconeogenesis to get to glucose. I know, it's very strange, but that's how they do it, okay? So what's the big deal, right? So why do we need glucose? Well, we need glucose for cellular respiration. Okay, so cellular respiration is what produces our cellular energy in the form of ATP. So ATP is really required for a lot of chemical reactions in the cells and in the body. And so this is our driving force, right? So the first step of cellular respiration is glycolysis, and it breaks down that glucose, okay, into what's called pyruvate, which then we utilize in the further steps of cellular respiration. Now, don't panic. Hopefully, this is a little bit of review, and you've seen cellular respiration before in maybe a biology class. But I don't want you to know the steps of cellular respiration. I just want you to know that glucose is required for the first step of cellular respiration, and it's required to essentially make ATP, right? So now we will talk about different things that can enter this different stages of cellular respiration. But if you want to go through the entire process of cellular respiration, we really need that glucose, okay? Now, the picture is just depicting kind of a very simplified version of cellular respiration, but the blue box right here, glycolysis, is that very first step of cellular respiration, which requires glucose. Now, this step happens outside the mitochondria. So we said mitochondria, if you go back to kind of biology again, is where cellular respiration takes place, which is the kind of the powerhouse of the cell, creating that energy. So the majority of cellular respiration happens within that mitochondria, okay? So again, don't panic. You don't need to know the steps of cellular respiration, just to, give you kind of a stepping stone of why glucose is so important and carbohydrate metabolism. So this kind of shows you that not just carbohydrates, but fats and proteins can be broken down into things we can use in cellular respiration. Okay, so like I said, glucose is really the only one that's going to be the start, right? Sugar is going to go straight to our glucose, which can go through glycolysis. But so can fats and proteins. So a lot of people don't think about this, but we can break fats and amino acids down into glucose, which can go through glycolysis, okay? So carbohydrates are just the easiest way to break it down to get glucose, but we can do fats and proteins, and we'll talk about fats and proteins in our next lectures. But the ultimate goal is to get that ATP, okay, that energy. So now let's talk about the hormone control of those blood sugar levels. So we said our blood sugar levels are very tightly regulated. And this is how much glucose we have in our blood, which is what we term blood sugar levels, but now we know sugar does not equal glucose, right? Sugar is sucrose, okay, which is a disaccharide, but we just, for ease of everything, we call it blood sugar levels, right? But really, it's blood glucose levels, okay? So what happens, right? So what happens after a meal? We eat maybe some sugar, some starch. We're going to increase that blood glucose level or blood sugar level. And our pancreas is going to release a hormone called insulin. So a lot of people are very familiar with insulin. And what insulin does is it actually tells the cells to either use that glucose, or it tells the liver to store it as glycogen, or tells other cells to store it as fat. So we essentially, insulin wants to get that glucose out of the blood, okay? So in response to the increased blood sugar, we release insulin, which then decreases our blood sugar level, okay? So what happens then if we skip a meal, right, and our blood sugar level is a little low? So we have decreased blood sugar level. Well, the pancreas is going to release a different enzyme, a hormone, different hormone called glucagon, okay? And glucagon essentially wants to increase the glucose in our bloodstream. So it's actually going to cause the breakdown of glycogen in our liver so that we can have more glucose in our bloodstream, okay? So glucagon increases the glucose in our bloodstream. Okay, so they do the opposite effects. So if you look at our graph, right, just a little example of it. So say you eat a meal, right, and you have an increase in your blood glucose, right, which is our red line. That's going to stimulate an increase in insulin, okay, which will then cause a decrease in the blood glucose so that you can stay around that healthy level of glucose in the blood. Okay, so it'd be the opposite for glucagon, okay. So this is just a different image to show you the differences between insulin and glucagon. So if you follow the different pathways, so let's start the red pathway first, which is we have an increase or high blood sugar level. That's going to cause insulin release from the pancreas, okay? Follow the red line down. That insulin is going to stimulate that glucose uptake, either into the tissue cells, or it's going to stimulate that glycogen storage, right, into the liver. So in the liver is where we are continuously kind of breaking down and creating glycogen, okay? So if we stimulate glycogen production, we'll lower our blood sugar, okay? So that's our red kind of pathway, okay? If we have high blood sugar, then we can follow the low blood sugar kind of in greenish blue here, and that's going to promote glucagon release from the pancreas. And then glucagon is going to stimulate that glycogen breakdown in the liver so that we can get more glucose into the bloodstream and raise our blood sugar level. Okay, so that's kind of the cycle of the hormones that are regulating blood sugar. So now let's talk about some disorders of carb metabolism. So we talked about kind of how it should work, right? We're kind of constantly breaking down polysaccharides, disaccharides into glucose. We're utilizing that glucose as energy for cellular respiration. We're storing that glucose as glycogen or fat. And that's just how we should be functioning, right? If we are eating a carbohydrate diet or having carbs in our diet. Now, we talked about how ruminants are different, right? So ruminants break down the cellulose into glucose, but they turn that glucose into volatile fatty acids, which they then use for energy, right? So they use that, turn that back into glucose. Okay, so ruminants are a little bit different, and they'll come into play when we talk about this disorder of ketosis. So ketosis means that you have an increase in ketones, and ketones are they're soluble compounds, usually acids such as acetone, and they are produced in response to a disorder in carb or lipid metabolism. So if you're not breaking down your glycogen, or say you've run out of glycogen, you're going to break down the fat. So you're going to break down fat, lipid metabolism, into fatty acids and then into ketones. Okay, so you're going to break down those fatty acids into ketones. And so ketones can be utilized as energy. Okay, so ketones do not equal bad. They equal bad if there's too many of them. Okay, so ketones can be a very natural process of lipid metabolism, but if you have an increase of ketones, that's ketosis. So an increased level of ketones in the blood can be called ketonemia, or increased ketones in the urine, which is ketonuria. Okay, so it can be normal, but you don't want too many of them. Okay, because what happens if you get into a state of ketosis and you have the increased ketones, you can get things that are similar to hypoglycemia, right? Because you have low glucose in your blood, depression, you're going to have loss of body weight, decreased milk production, and even abortion. Especially when you're talking about dairy cows. Okay, so this is important in the dairy cow production world. So this can be caused by an increased physiological demand, okay? Meaning you need more energy and you're not meeting your energy requirements with the carbohydrates. Okay, so this can definitely happen during lactation and pregnancy. Like I said, you see this with dairy cattle, okay? So this is just kind of a schematic, a little drawing to show you what happens if you don't meet that energy demand. So this is for cattle for in this picture, but you can talk about it in different animals as well, okay? So essentially, you don't have enough glucose, right? So for them, for ruminants, it's the propionic acid because then they turn that into glucose. So they don't have enough of the volatile fatty acids. They have low blood sugar, means that their liver is going to try to turn fat into ketones, right? To use ketones as energy instead because they don't have their glucose, they need something for energy to put into the cellular respiration, so they utilize ketones. But you have an excess of that, and you convert them into these ketone bodies, and then they accumulate in the urine and the milk, and you go into a state of ketosis. Okay, so which can be very bad for dairy cattle. So you might all be saying, but I've heard about this keto diet, right? So a lot of people say, okay, maybe we can utilize this idea of burning fat, okay, and having a low sugar, low carbohydrate diet, or keto diet, or even fasting would also do this to lower your blood glucose level. And what happens is then your insulin will lower, your blood glucose will lower, you're going to produce that glycogen, you're going to burn through your glycogen, or glucagon to burn through your glycogen in your liver, and then you'll start burning fat, okay? Which is not a bad idea, right? We want to get rid of our fat. So you're going to burn fat. The liver is going to break down that fat into ketones, and you utilize the ketones for energy, especially in your brain, and that's what you're worried about in terms of cellular energy, are the cells in your brain, very much so, but they can use ketones, okay? So they can use ketones as energy. Now, a lot of people will argue one way or the other whether this is healthy or not to be in this kind of state of ketosis. Now, arguably, you don't really want to be in a dire strait of ketosis, right? It can cause all of those problems. You know, maybe going in and out of ketosis, burning fat is not a bad thing, right? So your body can utilize ketones. You just don't really want that excess of ketones that could cause some problems. So anyways, you could argue either way, but I'm just saying that ketosis can be a problem in dairy cattle. But some of us humans, it's a new dietary fad as well. Okay. Now, another disorder of carbohydrate metabolism is diabetes mellitus. So there are different types of diabetes. So diabetes mellitus is specifically the problem with high fasting blood sugar levels. Okay. So blood sugar increases and our body is not responding to insulin. Okay, there's two types of diabetes mellitus, and that's type 1, which is also called juvenile or insulin dependent diabetes. Okay, which means that they specifically have a problem with producing insulin in their pancreas. So their pancreatic cells are not producing insulin, so that means their body isn't even looking at insulin, seeing insulin, so it can't even respond to insulin. So that is the more severe type because you can't even produce insulin, so you have to have a source of insulin given to you. Okay. Now, type 2 or adult onset or non-insulin dependent is the most common type of diabetes mellitus out there, and that's what you hear about most of the time when you say, oh, my aunt or my uncle has diabetes, right? So this is an abnormal response to insulin. So your pancreas is producing insulin. Your cells are just not responding to it. Okay, so yes, you could keep pumping in more and more insulin into your body in the hopes that your cells will finally listen to it. But there are other treatments for type 2 diabetes, such as weight loss and things like that, to try to get your cells to respond to insulin correctly. Okay. So that's the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Okay. Now, most people think that insulin resistance is another term for type 2 diabetes is only found in humans, but that's absolutely not true, especially nowadays that maybe we are feeding our domestic animals like we're feeding ourselves, and they're becoming more obese, okay? And so they are developing diabetes type 2, insulin resistance. Very similar in dogs and cats and horses. Okay, so you can see this insulin resistance found in all three of those species, and it is very similar to type 2 diabetes in humans. Okay, so a lot of people don't even realize that, but we are finding more and more cases of this insulin resistance in our pets, which is kind of sad because it's probably due to us, right? Overfeeding our lovely pets because we just can't help the cute little eyeballs, right? Begging for food. So there are some really cool things in the treatment of diabetes that a lot of people haven't even heard about. So obviously, you know, we try to throw insulin at diabetes, right? Increase insulin, you're going to increase the response of those cells. But they've actually found out that some animals have a natural venom or even spit that produces this interesting protein or peptide called GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide, that actually causes the pancreatic cells that produce insulin to release and produce more insulin. So if it produces more insulin, you're going to lower your blood glucose levels. So it's actually, it's been found to be a very successful treatment for diabetes. But also, if you look at kind of what GLP-1 does, it also acts in the brain as well and produces a satiative state, meaning you feel like you're satisfied, you're full, so you're not going to eat as much, which is really interesting as well. So I have a cool video on the Gila monster that produces this so they produce their venom from their spit, so it's kind of a mix of venom spit that actually has this GLP-1 peptide in it. And well as a kind of an interesting article on the platypus and the echidna that actually has this kind of GLP-1 in its venom, in its spikes on its back legs, which is very interesting as well. So they're actually finding that these animals produce this naturally, and we can utilize that to help fight diabetes, which is really interesting. And I remember way back years ago, my aunt was one of the first people that I knew personally that had diabetes, and it was kind of a long time ago, and we didn't really know much about diabetes, at least the general public. It wasn't as rampant as it is now. And I remember she used to say that she would take this Gila monster spit as a treatment, and we all thought she was crazy, but apparently that was kind of the start of the use of these animal venoms as a treatment for diabetes. So very interesting. I highly recommend looking into it because it's kind of interesting. So, and they're cool animals. That's true too. So I'll post these videos and articles on Canvas for you guys. So that's it for carbohydrates. So next week we're going to talk about lipids or fats, right? So good fats, bad fats, and everything in between, right? All right, thank you guys, and hopefully you guys have a good week, and I'll see you later.